Hello everyone, and welcome back to an extra special edition of A Casual Chat. This time we have a guest. So, myself, Rupert August, Henry, Simon, and Kurtz, but also Shrewd, if you would like to quickly introduce yourself.
How do you do? I'm ready to go. I've got my discount premium lager beer. I've got my opinion. We're ready to roll.
Excellent.
Yeah, we have neither of those things around here.
One at a time, please.
I just said I have neither of those things.
Because we don't like opinions around here.
We seek only truths.
What is it that we're going to be opining about this week?
Okay, so today we will be talking about whether culture is a bottom-up or a top-down phenomenon. Because, I don't know about you guys, but I've certainly heard different sort of schools of thought on the subject, and so there might be some opportunity for a little bit of discussion there, maybe a little bit of contradiction. I don't think that's something that the right in general has a position on necessarily either. It's sort of like something that's a little bit of a schism of sorts within the right, or part of a larger conversation between different factions of it. So, what do we think to start off with? If anybody would like to start, or shall I?
I think, because my opinion is fairly basic on this, and I haven't done much preparation, but I think surely it depends on which topic, and it will be varying across different not cultures, but different areas of the culture that you're talking about. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, kind of like a spectrum sort of thing.
Yeah. Sorry, go on.
That's the direction that I was going to take it as well, actually, because we kind of touched on this a little bit last time with a casual chat about cuisine or culinary culture, because you get different sort of countries that have different culinary cultures that are associated with different strata of society. So, as we talked about there, the French culinary culture has a little bit more of an aristocratic quality compared to something like a Spain or an Italy or a Britain, which has more of a sort of plebeian quality to it, or to different standards in all of those cases. So in Britain, it's a little bit more of a, I don't want to say low quality or anything, but Greggs being the epitome of this kind of thing, where you just have a cheap but like reliable quality bit of food, and then you kind of like get on with the rest of your day.
How depressing is it that Greggs is kind of a hallmark of British cuisine?
None. That it's non-depressing. It's inspiring.
Turning Point Greggs, tuning in.
It's the only cause I could get behind.
All right. Anyway, but I think that this probably applies in other areas as well, as you alluded to, Henry. So, in a lot of places, particularly like when you're talking about fashion and clothing, there's a certain amount of pragmatism that often goes into it, but it's very top down, especially when it comes to, fashions in particular and how they change over time, because it is often more determined by the people that are wearing the clothes rather than the clothes themselves. So that indicates something of the power dynamic that's coming in, where if a certain style of clothing is becoming associated with power, then that filters down in the form of fashion. And people want to kind of emulate that because it creates the association with power, which is, what a lot of people are trying to display to improve their status.
Are you implying that the whole idea of flared jeans was because people desired to look powerful?
In a roundabout way, I would say yes, probably. Or in
I would dare you to wear a pair of flared jeans and not feel powerful.
But if you go back a little bit in history, then you get the phenomenon being even more pronounced, because you have examples in kind of medieval era where people are just kind of stacking on garments or stacking on material onto their garments, and then folding it over and whatever, and perhaps wearing different layers, some of which are split, just so that you can display how much fabric and how much fancy dye you can afford. And that's very much an expression of power, but via the medium of money.
Being like a bird that swallowed a plate.
I believe this was called the Mall Goth era.
I mean, similar principle in a certain way, I suppose, probably.
Contrasting layers.
Yeah, to an extent.
With enough power.
Less for the aesthetic in that case. So it would be different. It'd be different shades if you go further into the past. Specifically, the kind of shades that are going to be most expensive. So you're just wearing money in a most literal sense.
this sounds like a ridiculous segue, but I do have a point here. Morgoths as a culture kind of begs the question: at what group size are we using the term culture?
So I wasn't specifically thinking in terms of subcultures, but I suppose that's also relevant.
Well, right, exactly. You know what I mean?
Okay. Well, if you've got a particular direction to take that in, to take that thought in, then go ahead.
Okay, so if you're going to talk about top down or bottom up, you certainly have to have a nexus for any argument from the bottom up, and the line in the sand there is exactly that. It's completely arbitrary. So small groups of people making aesthetic decisions, guided by kind of decoupled from power, as you were saying, just the random eddies of personal preference. Undeniably, that can have an upward drift, especially in terms of things like, well, subculture, like I'm saying, right? Those things have very real material impact, in a wider cultural and economic sense, and started with, like teenagers skateboarding, or people dyeing their hair. And those are just examples from the past 20 or 30 years.
Yeah, you're talking kind of like, there's quite a couple I can think of top of my head as well. Obviously you mentioned the skater style, there's also kind of like the punk movement, and then I guess the only thing that comes to most recent in mind of something that was a subculture and then kind of permeated into a lot of mainstream culture is rap and hip hop.
Right, and it's really easy to say this tongue in cheek, but in 2020, when Kanye West said I'm running for president, people were like, hang on, let's think about that for a minute, right? So that's not as ridiculous as a proposition as it may seem. I think there's a serious argument to be made for culture being bottom up, probably in a far less reliable or predictable way, because you can't exactly, you can't foresee that or forecast that in any way. But I think competing bottom up cultural movements are, vehicles for existing power. Think about how much money is behind, how can I say this diplomatically? For example, Black Lives Matter or Gay Pride in the past 5 to 10 years, right?
Yeah, definitely.
It probably goes both ways, but I think the nexus has to be bottom up.
To build on that, though, actually, if you want to go first, Henry, because I could probably go on for a little while on that point.
Well, I was just going to say, it depends on how much effect we think Rupert's initial point of sort of displaying your wealth in your fashion, and not necessarily fashion, even in terms of like your choice of car and things like that, your lavish expenses of the rich. How much sort of cultural impact that really having on the culture as a whole, rather than just being, the rich people are buying weird things or spending too much money.
I mean, this is initially where I was going to take this conversation, where I was thinking about it before we started recording, was the top of society is pretty much always exclusively those who are incredibly wealthy. And typically, I think this is especially the case these days, considering how material and monetary our society is that people want to emulate those top rungs of society who are able to afford, whether it be elaborate clothing or expensive cars or houses or what have you. That is, most people would desire to have a high-paying sort of, what would you call it? Executive is the wrong term, but a sort of a kind of job that would earn you a lot of respect from having
high
so
status.
That they can afford high status. Thank you, Rupert. A sort of high status job that would give you the pay in order to buy, a large extravagant house, a nice car, the latest in fashion, to then be emulated, to portray yourself as the picture of success, essentially, to emulate the super rich and the top of society.
I feel like what you're getting on at that is not so much talking about like an executive or CEO jobs, because those require a very specific personality to even be successful at, but I'm thinking more of what you're describing is basically a celebrity, or maybe more specifically some sort of like celebrity musician. So funny enough, like your Kanye West and others such as him.
Yeah, I didn't mean executive and CEO. I mean exactly what you and Rupert are saying. These celebrities or sort of any sort of high paid job that with grant your high status. That's what I meant to say. It was poor wording on my part.
And I feel to expand on that, because when you talk about the emulation of people desiring the emulation of this like of this high status lifestyle they talk about, is one of those things where it is where, you know, where this is where my biases come out, definitely, is the fact that I tend to find that for most rap and hip hop, I find the topics they talk about to be incredibly juvenile, in the sense of it almost feels like this is what a teenager going through puberty is thinking that he wants in his life, you know. Oh, I want all the money, I want all the bitches, I want all this, etc., etc., when most people reach a certain part of their life when, you know, I'm closer to 30 than I am 20, so I could definitely say that it's like, I think about like, oh, if I had all this money, what would I do with it? And my answer is, I have no idea. I don't think it would remotely satisfy me.
So are we somewhat settled on this idea of culture as not necessarily status signaling, but like firmly group signaling?
Not necessarily, I wouldn't say. So when you're talking about things, this is what I was going to come to earlier, is that we're perhaps talking about slightly different things insofar as the preferences, the accumulated preferences, are certainly something which generate a lot of outcomes, and you can look at that in a very bottom-up phenomenon kind of way. But then what is generating those preferences in the first instance is what I'm more kind of drawing attention to. So the idea of whether the desire for certain things is going to be, you know, derived purely from naturalistic phenomenons or like a trends and forces kind of perspective, or whether it's generated by something which is internal. And if it's internal, then it's usually something that's more to do with, you know, power and status in some regard.
My point there about when I said I found this particular subculture juvenile is I feel that the entire basis is on the emulation of something of high status. It almost feels like a very vapid and shallow perspective of what a high status life is like, and that's what, you know, rappers talk about. And it's not, like I said, it's a very like shallow take on it, but I feel like that kind of shows that it kind of almost went into a weird loop where something from on high influenced something from the ground. Something from the top influenced the bottom, and then the bottom started to influence the culture from the bottom up, even though its origin came from the upper rungs, if I'm making any sense.
Yeah, so from the top down, insofar as it generates demand and interest, and then from the bottom up in regards to how the demand then shapes certain levels of the trajectory, I suppose, of the phenomenon, if you're talking in kind of more markety sort of terms.
There's something to be said there for like feedback loops, I think.
Yeah. There was two examples that I was going to get into, actually, which, so to pull this right back round to the original point that you were making, Shrewd, the emergence of the teenager as a kind of like a relevant cultural entity, or like a relevant identity, is something that is very new, comparably speaking. So that is much more a phenomenon of kind of like the immediate post-war sort of period up to the 60s, I guess, is when you're still getting that subculture, I guess, being generated, but as a distinct portion of everybody's life that carries sort of certain expectations and has certain kind of unique demand patterns and consumption patterns. But do you look at that as a factor of, like a product of the individualization that you get through the signaling from a top-down perspective, or just in the culture that is already established of, kind of like liberal individuation and kind of atomization over time?
I think a lot of it is a product of technology and the ability to self-select.
Right. But this is part of the other option, is that, or you can look at it as I've generally been taught about it, which is that it's a product of the fact that these people had, their own income and were able to live in ways which distance them from their parents a little bit more, so they were less seen as an outcropping of their parents until they properly entered young adulthood.
I think a lot of this is just surface area, and being less integrated into a multi-generational community and having more time spent rubbing against other young people. I think it just results in a faster turnover of this stuff. So now we're like epsilon youth culture. You know what I mean? I guess the actual term is memetics, but
so you're saying that
modern memetics are what you saw on Instagram this morning, right? That's youth culture.
Yeah, there's a lot more of a separation between youth culture of 90s kids versus 80s kids, and it's a lot more separated, especially when you're coming out of school and university.
Yeah, exactly, and especially as it's become an emerging market since I guess the 60s probably. There's now, like I said, probably artificial demand to use that to serve capital, not economy.
Yeah, but I guess my question would be that if we do accept that this is a feedback loop that's causing it to spiral off, what first initiated that feedback loop, and then how is it subsequently guided? Because my sense is that there probably is some level of guidance there, unless you would say that it is just a purely organic phenomenon.
I suppose it depends where you place the inciting event.
I feel like it's a very difficult question to answer, just because it feels almost... Then again, it's one of these things where, a broken clock is right twice a day kind of thing, where something can be actually purely organic, but it can look guided. But I do feel like, at least as far as an inception point for where maybe this feedback loop kind of started, it would probably not so much be... I'm not going to specifically say the world wars... Not the world wars as events, but more for a very depressing and romanticized term, kind of like the death of the old aristocracy is where I would imagine its inception would be.
I don't know. I'm stuck on this bottom-up idea. I can't get away from it. And what I'm thinking is it's sort of inevitable once you have enough disuniformities from standard culture. So if you have your stable model of family and church, then I think you need not a critical mass. No, that isn't the right way of thinking of it, but that needs to in some way decay for any of this cultural accelerationism to start. So I guess I'd probably put it there.
Say that again. Just sort of reword it a little bit.
Okay, so I think you need preceding stable cultural norms to decay for this cultural accelerationism to take hold. Areas of society where you have, what can be seats of rapid change, I don't know why we keep going back to the 60s, but, the hippie movement or something like that.
Yeah. Well, I can give you another example that we could kind of mull over, although I imagine there's a little bit less just to draw on off the top of our heads as to what we know about it, but I perceive a similar surface level phenomenon in the generation of English as a unified language that would, unify both the upper and lower orders of English society. And that was very much a product of Edward III, actually. But you certainly could look at it in the perspective of, going from English, or not English, but Anglo-Saxon, like primitive Anglo-Saxon, leading into the Norman French that was being brought by the aristocracy, and then they kind of gradually harmonize over time, and then you hit that point where they actually formally harmonize, and then continue on a single trajectory rather than their own two separate trajectories. However, that was very much a project of a king himself, who had pragmatic reasons for pursuing that as a policy. And so I wonder if the same kind of thing could apply here in the 60s, where there was some reason for a powerful entity basically to create this group as a distinct entity in the same way that you kind of see now with certain elements of the left that want to try to create and, prop up existing almost artificial subcultures, I guess, or subcultures that are not necessarily that deep, but do so for the purpose of either acquiring more power or perpetuating their own power, or any number of other reasons linked to that kind of materialistic end.
I can hear the hammer and sickle intensifying over the horizon.
Right, exactly. So, I mean, that goes to another example of Ukrainian nationalism in the 1920s, being propped up as a matter of Soviet policy, because it would be then used to drive a wedge between Tsarist supporters, basically. So the kind of people who would be patriotic Tsarist supporters potentially, versus what this new entity was that was created. So you split the patriotic vote, as it were, as to who they want to support, and you can create extra supporters through means that, by getting people who would not necessarily naturally be on your side.
Right. Sorry, I did want to say something, but I've completely lost my train of thought there.
Where are you going with this? I don't quite understand.
Well, I'm saying that if this is all part of a... So, if we look at it just in terms of like what the actual consequences, I suppose, have been of this newly generated, as in, as of the 60s, teenage group of people who have their own identity and subculture, or rather, as of now, subcultures plural, and thus the power outcomes that come from that and the ability to shape ideas and such going forwards, how much of an effect that has had on the political landscape of the West ever since. Could you draw that back to an originary point where there was, some group who may have had reasons to push that through as a matter of future expedient, if you see where I'm going?
I do. I mean, yeah, so the only thing I've really heard about that is that it was mainly to be able to sell different types of products to different demographics, to be able to sell more things like toys and things of that sort of thing, which otherwise wouldn't have sold as well if you're just putting it out to the general market.
Yeah, sorry.
No, go on. I suppose to quickly finish off, which I think to me points it to be more of an organic phenomenon rather than a deliberate, more than a deliberate thing, because it's more based on the good old capitalist, how do I sell more things, and then the outcomes of those being unexpected.
That's kind of what I was getting. That's kind of just what I wanted to say, and what I meant when I said that sometimes it is hard to tell if this is guided or organic, just because because it's I almost feel like there's a certain nature of good grief, using capitalistic terms all the way. There's a certain amount of opportunity for being an entrepreneur, even if not necessarily for monetary gain. So while we kind of entertained the idea of the teenage subculture, or subcultures as they are now, being like a product of an attempt to influence Western culture, that might be the start, or it could be the fact that the starting point was a capitalistic endeavor, and then the people who wanted to influence culture rode on that, or vice versa. It's hard to tell.
Oh, wait, sorry. I just need to make sure I'm keeping up here with what you said specifically, Henry, just a moment ago. You were saying that a culture is started through a capitalistic intent in order to sell a product to that subculture. Just correct me if I'm following that right.
Yeah, I guess.
Right, because I can't help but feel like that's wrong. Surely you don't create a subculture so that you can then sell a specific product to them. That's just not how supply and demand works. Surely you wait for a culture to spring up, and then you find out what you can sell to that subculture. You don't create a product and then think to yourself, okay, then there's no one to sell this to. I now
No,
need to
but you can't create a market.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, is that if this is all a product of marketing, and having additional products or permutations of products that you either have already or could create easily, but wanting to create a new market for it. Oh, okay, I've got a perfect anecdote for this, actually. Listerine.
Hot topic.
Oh, interesting. Okay, well, I'll give my example and then you give yours. Listerine was the perfect case of having a product which was floor cleaner, where the margins are incredibly low, and wanting to create a new market for it. In fact, you can go back further than that. The formula for Listerine or original Listerine is essentially the same as the original antiseptic mist, I think, that was used in surgery environments to kill bacteria and such. And then they ended up just continuing to produce it, but used it for different purposes over time. So once once clean environments were basically introduced into surgery rather than just using antiseptic on everything, they instead just sold it as a surface cleaner instead. But they decided the margins weren't very high for that, so they instead basically created a new market for it by pioneering this new term for bad breath, halitosis, which is not something that had really existed much prior, or something that people have been particularly cared about, but because it sounded like something that was medical in nature, or like a medical problem, therefore you had to buy this new product with a massive markup to remedy that problem.
Ah, yes, of course, the beloved mouthwash subculture. How could I forget?
Well, in that case, it's not a subculture, but it's the same phenomenon of marketing creating demand from already having supply, or stimulating demand where it was not there but prior.
Right, okay, I understand where you're coming from.
Cabal.
What was that, sorry, Shrewd?
I said I'm so sick of the big dental hygiene cabal.
Say the sheer level of blatant capitalism here is making me want to join the Marxists.
What I was going to say before is that I think some culture just has an easier time propagating than others. And although with sufficient will, you can kind of make people do anything. I think that there are peaks and troughs of effort required to, turn a certain subculture to your benefit. People talk about the 2016 Donald Trump election being, encouraged by groups of schizophrenics on the internet rather than like the entire media machine. And I think that's because that was the right idea at the right time. And that's probably a very important part of the random elements of why cultures arise. Maybe only in the modern era does that make sense. But I think that is very important.
I think I do agree with you. I think to take it back and continue with the example of teenagers, and especially in children, I think maybe part of the reason why it became so prevalent was, kids like bright, flashy lights. They like colourful things. It's sort of part of their nature. You don't think you need to teach that. And so if you've got a movement in the right place at the right time, marketing to something that people are sort of predisposed to want, I don't think it's that crazy to have a fairly large cultural impact.
To be a little bit nerdy on the front of the bright colours thing, that's usually just because children don't quite have the fully developed parts of the brain to fully recognise certain colours, so bright colours work best.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then let's bring that back. Does that qualify as top-down culture? Because I think in a lot of ways it probably does. If some marketing executive is basically the one that's deciding the fact that there is going to be a new, teenage subculture that is created around these bright, flashy colours or something. So the executive that decided to craft My Little Pony in the way that they did. Well, friendship is magic, is it? Is that the...
Let's not get into it.
Right. You know what I'm talking about there now.
Yeah.
Hasbro's a fucking terrifying juggernaut in how it's just cornered the market so damn well in this regard.
Right, but is that top-down culture then?
I'd say yeah.
Actually, yeah, because I don't remember I'm pretty sure Hasbro owned the two biggest properties, which would have been My Little Pony and Transformers, and they were so determined to kind of I guess influence I don't know if you'd call it influencer culture, but kind of create a they were so determined to get this like market out of the under their control and everything that, you know, suddenly you have now several serialized My Little Pony and Transformers series, like animated series.
They were trying to create a toy subculture, you mean?
Yeah, I think that would probably be the best way to describe it.
I mean, you could call a fandom a subculture. I could see that as working.
But I think that is definitely, at least to me, that sounds very top-down. I suppose there is an argument to be made that these are not necessarily executive decisions, but decisions made by the market, essentially. Like, what people are interested in, they will buy, which I don't know. Like, there is an argument there to be made about how that's not necessarily top-down. That's more of a culture-wide phenomenon.
What if it was My Little Goat? What if it was My Little Pig? What if they were Transformers?
Now, you see, this is why you're not in charge of a marketing firm.
But exactly, that's exactly what I'm getting at. I don't know if calling that top-down is correct, because what is marketing? Is marketing enforcing My Little Pony on people, or is it recognizing that that's the that's where the tailwind is? That's the best idea. In the same way as punks in fucking Portland or Seattle or wherever fuck in the 70s, it would be correct to market that. I think, and I don't know how much you can say that's a predation of capital to back this stuff, than you can saying it's the right idea at the right time. You know, all of these seemingly random low-level cultural stuff not getting picked up. It's impossible to say to what degree that would have ever landed. So what comes to mind here is, remember Google Glass? Remember when we were all going to have augmented reality in 2012 and the biggest tech company put everything behind it, and it just absolutely fell flat.
Yeah.
There are so many bottom up non-starters and top down misfires that I think it's basically impossible to untangle, and this is a fruitless conversation.
Yeah, I'm beginning to think that we're not that we're going about the conversation wrong, but more I blame myself for bringing up company names, but I am wondering if maybe we're being a bit too focused on capital as an idea, you know, people doing things for monetary gain, when maybe we should be looking at the idea of culture being influenced, you know, bottom up or top down based on, I guess, ideology and power.
I don't disagree with you, but I think that
a bit untangle money from that, because money is also part of the power system.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I think the reason that there is such a focus on money and capital is because that is where, at least in our capitalist societies, that's where the power is basically originating. It's less of a oh, I have power, therefore I get money, and more, at least in a lot of cases, it's I have money, therefore I have power.
Maybe focus away from necessarily the monetary gain of markets and more on the effects of markets. So better, I don't know, just to narrow down this the scope and conversation, so that we're not just constantly talking about market forces.
Well, that's the thing. I think that we've hit on a very important point, that culture is a market.
I agree.
You know, unless you're going to make everybody speak the same language on any sort of local or small scale resolution, it's entirely market driven.
It's funny you should mention making everyone speak the same language, though, because that very much is a phenomenon. So we kind of take it for granted now that people, say, in Lombardy can pretty much perfectly understand people from Sicily, but that's not been granted until the deliberate project of fascism Italian fascism as a unifying entity, deliberately and purposefully homogenized the Italian dialects and the Italian kind of sense of self, and then that was built on later by the proliferation of television that exposed everybody consistently to the exact same accents in the same way that we had in the UK with the RP accents in the 60s and 70s. So I would probably speculate based on that if you were to go back, say, 80 years or something, then you'd see much greater differences in accents in the UK as well, to the extent that some of them might be mutually unintelligible.
That's so funny.
Some of them are today, to be honest.
Well, yeah.
Have you heard Glaswegians?
Yeah, that's the issue. But again, that goes back to being a very centralized phenomenon in those cases, and that's very much like a project that is either consciously or semi-consciously pursued deliberately as a method of homogenization, I guess, maybe. I mean, it certainly is in the French case, where they basically had a deliberate policy to eradicate every other language. And all of these have been deliberate policies, I would say.
So, I think before we move on from markets too much, I think it's something to be said of viewing these cultural shifts as a sort of cultural market in and of itself, where you'll have, as we've said, a melting pot of these cultural changes that will either take hold or not, depending on whatever timing that they appear in, or whether they're whether they fit with the current shift and shift the current culture slightly, or whether it's completely opposed. But then you will also have actors that are acting on the market trying to personally gain from it. So in the same way that you have people investing and spending money where they will to try and get some money back, you will have people in the cultural market, as it were, investing in air quotes and trying to see a cultural change that they'd like to take out.
Yeah, so, I mean, okay, you're going to have to correct me if I'm at all wrong with this, Henry, but to use maybe an example, what you're getting at is the idea that you've got, and to just use a current group that's around, you got BLM, and BLM wants to shape, at the very least, the Black American subculture, while also kind of funding the Democrats and also trying to influence their culture to then try and influence the whole of American culture. Is that kind of what you mean when you're talking about people acting on this on the cultural market forces?
Yeah, I think so.
Sure, cultural change is a goal in and of itself, definitely.
I guess my question then would be whether there are any marketing missteps that are outside of that marketing realm that come to mind. So, you talk about a large company that threw a lot of weight behind a product and it didn't take. Is there anything like that comes to mind with just more purely in the cultural sphere? Nothing necessarily comes to mind to me. I can only really think of successful examples. So, just to throw out another random one, the fact that we put up Christmas trees is effectively single-handedly a product of Prince Albert, I think, of Victorian era fame.
I mean, the only downside one that comes to mind, and even then maybe you can never tell if it's deliberate or not, but I'm thinking about what happened to Venezuela when it elected democratic socialists in.
The example I would give, and I might get a bit of shit from it from you guys, is the Brexit referendum, where there seemed to be a lot of cultural weight put behind, okay, we'll have the referendum, but we need to make sure that Brexit doesn't happen because we want to stay within the EU. And it seemed like they wanted it to be more of a confirmation of, yes, we do want to stay in the EU and get all the benefits from that, whilst still getting the vote of, those that might not like the EU so much and gaining in that sense. And then, obviously, they being the Conservative Party, they then needed to deal with the fallout of it and ended up needing to, sort out Brexit when they didn't want to do that in the first place. I don't know if that's a good example or not, but it's one that comes to mind.
That's not a terrible example, but I would raise some issue with the idea of framing it around a question that is asked in the political sphere, because I think once you actually get to asking the question vocally, then you change the outcome in a way that you don't if you just rely on what would it be, manifested preferences. just through action without thinking. I think that's when you get the most pure form of, or the most pure expression of preferences, when it's something that is just conducted unconsciously. And in that sense, the referendum definitely doesn't work.
I suppose the issue is that I'm not quite sure what you'd call... So obviously when you're talking about the actual financial markets, there's a very easy metric of, oh, look, they spent this much money. But what are they spending in the cultural market, I suppose is the question.
It could still be money, I suppose, if they're trying to... So the closest thing that comes to mind to me, although it's still slightly in the kind of market realm, is this recent push towards, let's call it what it is, ugly marketing that is meant to tick boxes for one reason or another, for diversity and inclusion.
Yeah.
So the movement away from traditional aesthetic beauty for the sake of a political project. And I guess the question of whether or not that is going to be successful in shifting opinions is something that, like shifting opinions and shifting perceptions, is something that will get a concrete but not unambiguous answer, as much of a contradiction as that might sound, on this question of whether it's top down or bottom up. Because if there is just a bottom up set of like entirely natural proclivities which can't be shifted, like regardless of the amount of signaling that's taking place from a top down perspective, then we'll at least know that you have to work within certain bounds. And I wouldn't go all the way to the top down perspective insofar as there isn't certain bounds that have to be worked in. I don't think you can. I think at least it's going to be much more of an uphill battle to struggle against natural proclivities in the form of culture. But that actually just brings me on to another interesting idea, which would be, what about like culturally pushed antinatalism? Because that seems like something that a lot of power centers are putting their weight behind, and with some amount of success, it would seem.
Pardon, can you repeat that? Anti-what, sorry?
Natalism, as in not having children. Like the push against having children.
Yeah, you saw a lot of that just a couple of years ago, didn't you?
Yeah. Or on the inverse side, you have Hungary and a couple of other countries, Russia most notably actually, which are doing the reverse, and they are signalling in favour of natalism, or pro-natalist, in a pro-natalist direction, and they are seeing notable rises, year-on-year rises in their birth rates, which seems to put pay to the idea that it's just a kind of natural outcome of living in a modern society, which is the kind of trends and forces argument that people like to make around that. That as you urbanize a society more, and as you get increasing levels of technology and such, then the birth rate gradually drops. But they seem to have been able to reverse this through a combination of traditionally minded, like pro-tradition policies and pro kind of nativist policies, and overt pro-natalism.
I feel also I know this is kind of just what influences everything anyway, especially on a grand scale, is just the incentives anyway. I do understand that Hungary and Russia did both kind of implement policies that incentivize growth rates, basically.
A very similar things happening in Japan at the moment, and it's not Rupert August casual chat until either Rome or Japan has been brought up, so you're welcome. But you're seeing the same thing where it's this highly industrialized, urbanized country where birth rates have absolutely plummeted, and it's a country that still promotes its traditional values and where the government is promoting pronatalism, and yet their birth rates are still in decline. So it's not an open and shut, cut and dry sort of. Yeah,
that's true. That's interesting.
Yeah, fair point.
That comes down to the incentives, though, doesn't it? Like, is Japan, while Japan's taking a the stance, is it actually doing anything to more incentivize and encourage it?
As far as I'm aware, there are things like government grants for starting a family.
And I was going to say, as far as I know, they're not exactly overtly encouraging to having a lot of women in the workplace, which would potentially factor into this whole equation.
I'm afraid I don't know enough about how they're promoting sort of women in the workplace or stuff. Things like that,
Yeah. But on that note, should we round it off here? Or does anybody have any final points they'd like to make?
So what we were saying before, we kind of touched on this conspiratorial idea of a grand plan behind the hippie movement. I don't know why what came to mind, but whatever. And this most recent idea of incentivizing birth rate, that will have like long spanning cultural effects for this generation being born in, the last, whenever it came into about 5 years. And that probably takes a lot less will than fixing the problem that Japan's in. Like a much worse demographic situation than Hungary. So what we were talking about before was the amount of top-down effort required to push the ascendant bottom-up cultural ideas that you want. And I think a very important part of that is when you do it, doing that ahead of time can save you huge amounts of effort.
Yeah, I think I would probably, so just to kind of build on that idea, I suppose, as I sort of alluded to, I would say that you do get, or that there are certain sort of natural parameters that are worked within. And so the more that one tries to push against those, the more difficulty one would have. So, although I may on balance say that culture is a more of a top-down phenomenon than a bottom-up phenomenon, if you're trying to promote a set of cultural values which lead to quick death, basically, that if you're trying to encourage a lifestyle that is going to cause people to die very quickly, then they're going to be naturally resistant to that, unless you can dress it up this just gets into the idea of there being a much higher cost involved with promoting that. But that when you're working against those certain natural parameters, which at the extreme end is the desire to preserve life, then you're going to have a much harder time of it.
Sorry, did you just say that you're going to have a hard time pushing a culture that promotes people kill themselves?
Yes.
Explain the fast food industry to me real quick, please.
Well,
tastes good.
Yeah, but my point there would be that there's a lot of marketing that goes into all this stuff, and that is a lot harder than simply creating food that makes people feel good, both in the short term and the long term.
Also, in response to that fast food thing, you are aware that the Conservatives are actually trying to bring out like some sort of new health initiative or some policies to try and help. I use help in giant quotation marks here to help with the obesity epidemic.
Yes, I'm aware of that. I also remember that I think it was just last year they made it illegal to sell an energy drink to someone who was under the age of 16. So there are things being done about that.
I'd say I'm of the opinion that's entirely fair, considering that most of those have something like 280 calories in them. In regards to the top-down, bottom-up thing, I am still very undecided on it. The idealist in me wants to believe it's very bottom-up and that it's, there isn't some big power, rich and powerful cabal of individuals that are just pulling all the strings. But I feel like there is a lot of historical precedence anyway to say that there is a lot of top-down meddling. So maybe it's a mix. Maybe it's a mix of both. Maybe it's one or the other. I just don't know.
I mean, that's something that I came into this thinking, yeah, it's top-down. I feel like it's pretty top-down. But after having this conversation, I feel like it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. What is a subculture created by a group of people wanting to influence their way upwards, and then some marketing company comes in and tries to capitalize on that? Or is the marketing company creating that subculture in order to create a new potential market? It's kind of hard to draw a line under that.
Yeah, I think to round it off, or round my point off, going back to the cultural market, I think the reason I made that point was because I think it's a bit of both. You will have everyone with a small amount of cultural capital. The capital is flowing both ways, and whilst those at the top might have a bit more, it might not be as much as, say, the sum of the parts of the bottom.
Okay. I think that does it then. I think this has been a really good conversation. Thanks, everyone. And goodbye.